Thanks, Nicole, and thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for coming out on a Wednesday morning. So I think what I want to talk about basically is the concept of end and how it relates to story. And in particular, if we don't stop telling the story that we've been telling ourselves about who we are and how we interact with our planet, then we're not going to save our planet. That our survival actually depends on us telling a new story about how we interact with our environment. And in a similar way, I want to talk about the stories we tell ourselves as individuals, and if how those stories are limiting and aren't serving us, then we're not able to be and do the things we want to do in the world. And I speak to that from direct experience, because once I started changing the story I was telling myself about 10 years ago, it fundamentally changed who I am as a person and the things I felt capable of doing in the world. So I want to share some of my story to begin with, which is this guy here. And I say to people often that I was a rare human whose face actually grew into his teeth. It doesn't normally happen that way, it's the other way around. But really before that, my story started when I was about 14 months old. My mum and dad decided to part ways, which in hindsight I think was a really good thing, because my dad was adamant that he was going to call me Craig, but my mum wanted to call me Stefan. And I was like, you guys need to just split up. This is never going to work, okay? But I sort of locked that story in for a long time, that I was a child of a broken marriage, and, it was really tough for me as a child, and I really struggled to get through, But then I went to a school that was an all-boy Jesuit Catholic school. Again, I got a lesson in story, in the power of ideology, and the deep flaws of ideology and story. Two of my teachers are now in prison. I then moved on from there and went to university, and I thought I wanted to be a journalist, so studied that for a while, lived in China for a while, learnt Chinese, not many people know that, for 8 years, spoke Mandarin fluently, don't use it much anymore except at restaurants. Then I decided to go to NIDA and be an actor, because I thought I didn't know my own story, I wanted to start telling other people's stories. And I had some experiences with that were quite beneficial. I enjoyed it. I travelled the world. I was lucky enough to meet a lot of great people. I went to film festivals. I had a few experiences in Hollywood, but it just never felt right. I was hiding behind other people's stories. I didn't have the courage to actually speak my own truth. It was very convenient to be an actor, to be fed, to be picked up, to be lauded. People clapped you. They recognised you in the street. It was a false sense of validation. And it never really sat with who I was or the stories that I wanted to tell in the world. But thankfully, I met this human. This is my wife, Zoe, who I met 10 years ago. And as soon as I met her, I knew that the story I was telling myself wasn't going to cut it. I'd really cultivated this image of a rolly smoking, velvet jacket wearing Lothario actor guy. And I met her and I went, you know what, Marlboro Lights and MDMA just not going to cut it anymore. I've got to drastically tell a new story, because she was vibrating at a very different frequency to anyone I'd ever met. So really, that kick-started this quest for me to start finding my new story, but in particular, unravelling the story I told myself. So I went on a real exploration of discovery. I drank the Kool-Aid. I took psilocybin, I read every self-help book there was, I did courses, I did a 10-day silent retreat, I went into the Amazon, took ayahuasca, did everything to try and understand deeply who I was, what were these patterns of behaviour that I downloaded from my mum and dad, and what was the new story I wanted to tell myself. In particular, to impress her and try and make sure it worked, but also to understand why I wasn't feeling quite right with my place in the world. What was that thing that was jarring me? And in particular, something that really changed me was I was quite sick in hospital for a week, and I was sharing a ward with 4 other 85-year-old people, or 4 85-year-old people, not other 85. But, which was quite a funny experience actually. It would make a very good sitcom, the stories we told, and yeah. But I actually sat up one night about 2 a.m. and I wrote myself a letter as though I was 85 in that room with them. And the letter was about what have you done in your life? Did you actually take the risks that you wanted to take and tell the stories you wanted to tell? In this short slice, in all the history of space and time that we get on this planet, this 85 years, were you courageous? Or did you hide behind other people's stories? And I wrote this letter and read it, and I thought, I don't want to read this letter at 85 and be frustrated or angry or upset. I want to have the courage to tell the stories I do. So I started making a film for the first time, which was the Tropfest film. And I didn't want to put it in Tropfest, it was just a small animation that I made because my wife was making me do this weird detox cleanse for 3 days, and we were drinking clay and all sorts of weird stuff. And I thought, if I'm going to do that for you, I want to make something and do something creative. So I made this short film that was really daggy. I made it for kids. It was about animals and trying to look after the planet. And my wife said, well, you've got to enter into Tropfest. And I said, I'm not going to enter into Tropfest. It went so against my cool velvet jacking persona. And it won. And it was the best thing that ever happened because it was the night that my old story blew to smithereens and this new story emerged. And I remember receiving the award and saying to the audience, really? Like, really? Because I was so disconnected from the person I was to what this audience had responded to, which was the daggy part of me, which I really tried hard to hide. And there I was receiving an award for it. But also the next day I received so much backlash, as most Tropfest winners do, that I'd plagiarised it, I'd copied it, it was a piece of shit that never should have won. It cost $80, which didn't help. There were 2 films that cost $120,000 that year, so I think they were pretty angry at me. But it was a great lesson, again, in the stories I told myself about, I don't want to put myself out there, it'll be too painful, I don't want to receive the backlash. All of that happened. And it wasn't anywhere near as scary as I thought it was going to be. So once you get on the other side of that fear, it looks this big. Whereas when you're on this side of it, it can look overwhelming and can really limit the things you want to do in your life. So then, really, I feel like my life headed off in a different direction. I'd started to end that old story and tell a new story. Then this little rascal came along. This is our daughter, Velvet. And suddenly, it wasn't just about my story. I was also responsible for someone else's story and what impact a story was going to live well beyond my own. And that prompted me to make that sugar film, which was really about understanding the role of nutrition in our own health and what impact it's having on the planet and to all of us. But also it taught me about telling a story not about fear and saying, hey, sugar's really bad and poisonous and you should never touch it, but saying, look how much better your life can be without it. So choosing to tell a story in a positive way, in a motivating way. And that led to the last 3 years of my life, which has involved telling the most important story I think I'll ever tell, and will probably keep telling this story for the rest of my life. And that's about this beautiful thing that we're all sitting on right now. And the story that we've been telling about this thing and what we're doing to it right now. So that thin layer of atmosphere you can see there, which is actually thinner than the skin of an apple by comparison. That's how thin it is. That's where we're putting all this pollution in right now. And even if we stop putting pollution in it tomorrow, we've put so much in it already that we've locked ourselves into 300 or 400 years more of warming and increased damage. So what I've done for the last 3 years is try and find a way to not only stop polluting the atmosphere, but then try and find ways to pull the carbon and the pollution that's already in there out. And I spoke to an environmental psychologist really early, a woman named Renee Lertzman, and she was the most important researcher that I spoke to. And she said that when we keep hearing stories that come with fear and dread and overwhelm, especially about our future, which you could argue is all we're hearing about in the media right now. Every day there's a story about how cataclysmic things are and how doomed our future is. Every Hollywood film we see, the future has no nature in it. It's all robots chasing humans that are living in slums. We are just being bombarded with negativity. And she said that when that happens, it activates a part of our brain called the limbic system. And when that limbic system is activated, it shuts down our prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is where we problem solve and where we think creatively. So we're causing this widespread paralysis amongst all of us because all we're hearing is the dread. And it's very hard to know what to do with that. How do you fight climate change? What does 2 degrees warming mean? What does anthropogenic mean? These are all amorphous terms that we don't know what to do with. Or how do we feel we can make an impact just individually on our own? It's too overwhelming. So what I wanted to do is change that narrative, or at least add to it. We need to acknowledge that things are bad, but a motivator for all of us is hope. Any psychology textbook will tell you that. The work of Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, talks about that. How important it is as human beings to have the possibility of a better future or a better outcome. That's what moves us forward. So for my daughter and all her generation, that's what I've done for the last 3 years. Gone around the world and tried to find the best solutions to fixing this planet. And I was gobsmacked, to be honest, about how many things are out there. And we just don't hear about them in the mainstream media. It's not newsworthy. Rebecca Solnit wrote a beautiful book called Hope in the Dark. And it's about, if you want to be inspired, don't look on the main stage where all the spotlights are focused. You go into the shadows, off to the side of the stage, because that's where the flurry of activity and hope is happening. And I've seen that firsthand. I learned about decentralized energy systems right around the world. So at the moment we get all of our energy from a top-down big corporation that control our energy and then distribute it to us. But the future is peer-to-peer, sharing our energy from house to house. Everyone will have a solar panels, battery, they'll get a small box, and they'll be able to buy and sell their energy between each other. You'll even be able to donate your energy if you're going away. And that's already happening in Bangladesh, Africa, India. This technology is already available. I learned about new transportation systems, how we can reduce the number of cars on our roads. At the moment, the predictions are for an extra 1 billion cars by 2040. And even if they're all electric, we just don't have the resources to do that for individual ownership. So we've got to find new ways of reducing the number of cars on our roads. You can't really see that well, but I looked at the power of soil, and this was incredible to me, to learn how all this carbon that's in the atmosphere that's doing us damage can actually pull back down into the soil. And once it's put in the soil, it fundamentally changes the health of our food and the water retention of that soil. My favourite stat is that you'd have to eat 8 oranges today to get the same level of vitamin A that a single orange had 60 years ago because of the health of the soil. We've been destroying our soils, mining the carbon of them, putting constant chemicals on them, and the UN says we've only got 60 years of topsoil left. So this is the foundation of our civilization. This is one of the most important things we have to get right. And I also learnt about our oceans, how 93% of the excess heat from global warming is going into our oceans and wiping them out, destroying marine life, destroying seaweed all around the world. But scientists are now discovering ways to regrow the kelp, which creates a forest, or like a thriving ecosystem for fish to lay their eggs in again. Because our fish populations are struggling. 13 of 17 have collapsed around the world. So we need to find ways to regenerate the oceans. But this seaweed also, it's the fastest growing organism in the world and can grow up to 0.5 metre a day and over 50 metres long. So it's turbocharged, sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. And then the seaweed itself can be used for biofuels and plastics, fertiliser. Even now they've found if they give it to cows, it lowers their methane emissions by up to 80% just from chewing the seaweed. And probably the biggest surprise I learnt was the role of educating girls and empowering women on climate change, which is very rarely linked together. The statistics show that if a girl doesn't get to complete her education, she's pulled out of school for a range of reasons, religion or to work, she'll have 5 or more children. But if she gets to complete her education, gets access to reproductive health services, work opportunities, she then gets to choose when and how many children she'll have, and that number comes down to 2. And the UN says that's a difference of 1.1 billion people by 2050, which has a profound impact on our resources and climate change. So we should empower girls anyway. That's a great thing to do, but we get this lovely bonus that helps the environment at the same time. But despite all those solutions I've found, which are really simple and we can put them together and make it happen, what I really understood was the role of story and the way we talk about our planet. The film really is about shifting that paradigm. And if you go back pre-scientific revolution, we did tell a very different story about our planet. And there's a wonderful language that different cultures used to use about the planet. We know that Aboriginals used to use the word custodians of the land. But the Egyptian culture and the Native American Indian, Mother Earth and Father Sky. The Chinese referred to themselves as reverent guests of the land. There's a beautiful story that we just don't hear anywhere near enough about an Admiral Zhang who in 1436 sailed the world for 33 years with 27,000 men on 300 ships. Not to conquer, but to share animals, exchange goods, explore the wonders of the world and bring it back to his emperor. Columbus did it again 50 years later in a very different story. Then you get to the scientific revolution, so 17th century. Francis Bacon, René Descartes, suddenly the language and the metaphor and the story about our interaction with the planet changes. Bacon uses terms like we must hound nature in her wanderings, put her in constraints, enter and penetrate her every corner. It's such an aggressive, extractive, raping language. And that's how we fundamentally changed our relationship with the planet from that moment on. It's not to say that science hasn't delivered wonderful things, but a new way, a new story of looking at the world emerged. And I often think that we've become so reductionist now with the way we look at the planet that we don't, it's like Shakespeare. If you looked at it through a scientific lens, it's just 26 letters on a page rearranged. But why we love Shakespeare is because of the meaning we give it to it, and the beauty and the wonder that it evokes. And we need to do the same with the planet. Because for too long we've just looked at it as a cold rock floating through a galaxy through a very scientific lens. But as we know, it's much more than that. It's this interconnected, interwoven, rich ecosystem of life that supports us and that we're a part of. And that's the language we've got to talk about if we're going to get through this. I think the only way we're going to get through this is to encourage more dreaming and more creativity and more imagination. And we have to do this at a time where we're being bombarded with information. We're on our devices all the time. We don't let ourselves sit idle and get bored and dream enough anymore, especially our children. We're in the present by the information we're getting all the time. And if you look at all the great works of art, imagine Van Gogh getting home with his bunch of flowers and just putting them on the table and picking up his Instagram feed. Or Monet sitting in front of a lake with the water lilies and just going, oh, that's nice, but what's on Twitter today? You know? This is what we're doing at the moment. And people trying to make their kids Einsteins and filling them with information. You've got to learn more, learn more. That's not what Einstein did. He rode his bike. He was a dreamer. He wandered around and let himself have idle time and came up with these beautiful concepts. So I try and do that now. It's a rule I've made like once a week. Be bored. Go and sit outside somewhere for an hour without your phone and just sit there. And it's tough. But you start to notice your own story and the things that you're telling yourself. And then you start to dream and have ideas again. And I'd urge all of you to do that. We need to do it for your own benefit and for the benefit of the planet. I was lucky enough recently to spend time in Bhutan, and every morning the residents of Bhutan don't get up and have a coffee and check their Instagram. They do 7 laps of a temple. And the first few laps, they think about an intention for themselves. What's their story for the day? What do they want to do in their own lives? And then the last 3 or 4 laps, they set an intention for the planet. And they go beyond their own story and think about the collective story. Just imagine the profound impact that would have if we all started doing that. In fact, let's do it. Everyone stand up. Let's stand up and close your eyes. Close your eyes and straight away, just notice what story you're telling yourself, even in this moment. Are you like, oh man, this is a bit annoying. This dude's frustrating. I can't do this. This is awkward. Whatever it is, listen to your own story that you said by standing up and just shutting your eyes with a large group of people. Just take a moment. Anything that you think is limiting, something that you tell yourself on a daily basis, and just set an intention over the next few weeks to just take time to stop. If you're in a cafe waiting for a friend, don't check your phone. Just sit and be idle and start to notice any story that might be limiting, any pattern, any phrase that you tell yourself that just isn't helping you in your story. And now I want you to imagine a doorway ahead of you. There's a doorway probably 10 meters in front of you, still with your eyes closed. And very soon we're going to walk through that door, and in that door is going to be the world in 20 years from now, in 2040. And it's a world based on the fact that maybe next year or the year after we really started to get our shit together. And we started to fundamentally change the way we're operating. Governments take action. The climate strikes have really worked. There's huge progress around the world, and we're starting to build this better future that we want. So walk through that doorway now. And what do you see? And what does it feel like? And what does it sound like? Let's imagine the better world that we want. And if anyone wants to share, just tell us what you can see. What do you want to see in this beautiful new future? The rooftop gardens, the less cars, the children playing, people riding bikes. What does it look like? Share it. Who wants to share? More community, beautiful. Lots of trees, yeah. Sharing, yep. Lots of smiling, great. Kindness, yeah. Is there music? Music on the streets? No waste. Things are sourced locally. Yep. Sounds of nature. Yeah, sounds of nature. Birds, less cars. And just feel what that would be like. All that combination of things. Great. Thanks, everyone. If you sit down. What the Buddhists say in Bhutan is that if we can't see and feel and imagine this better world, then we can't move into it. And that goes for your stories you tell yourself. If you can't imagine your new story, then how can we move into it? And that's why I made the film 2040, was just to plant the seeds of some new images that we can be guided by. Not the dystopian ones that we're getting all the time, but actually a world that we do want to live in, that all of us deep down want to live in. But if we don't start creating that world, we're going to march into someone else's world that they've created for us. This is about us finding our power again and our ability to dream and imagine what world we want to live in. So if we don't end the destructive story that we're telling ourselves now about our planet, we're not going to move into a better world. And if you're not the hero of your own story, then it's not really a story worth telling. So start editing. Start telling the story of yourself that you want to live. Because the planet actually needs you to do that as well, really badly. We need heroes right now. My favourite quote is Robert Swan. The greatest threat to the planet is the belief that someone else will save it. There's no one else. I think we're seeing that with our leadership right now. There's no one. It's actually up to us. So I hope for my daughter and all her generation and all the generations to come that you find a new powerful story about what your role is in this. Because the earth is hiring. Thanks. Yeah, so who else is telling this story? That was probably the toughest part of making 2040, was seeing how far behind Australia is. Like, it's It's really, really tough, actually. We are, all the Nordic countries, obviously, I could have filmed the whole film in 2040. Examples there are, like Norway, for example, now has 50% of all new vehicles are electric cars. So in the same way we've got service stations everywhere, they've got electric charging stations, just as prevalent. The government takes any tax off. They give free parking, free toll use to anyone who buys a car, electric car. We charge a luxury tax. So a Tesla in Northern Europe is about 25 grand, and it's 100 and something here. So their waste management, I mean, Stockholm now have, in the main city, there's a tube that goes out the front of every house, and you put your food waste in there. They come and collect that food waste twice a day. They put it into what's called an anaerobic digester. They extract the methane from that and run all their public vehicles and council cars off that. Then they give the leftover food waste to farmers who use it on their soils as a natural fertiliser. And they've been doing that for 10 years. So there are so many great things going on, but we are way behind. In fact, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Earth Overshoot Day, which came out recently, and it sort of looks at resource use of different countries around the world. Australia, if the rest of the world lived the same way we do and used the same amount of resources, we'd need 5 planet Earths. So we are incredibly indulgent as a country, and just aren't getting the leadership that we need right now. So it is up to local councils and us to take the action, because we're going to be the last to react. Yeah.
So what's the difference between Australia and Norway in terms of why aren't we acting psychologically like that?
Yeah. Difference between Australia and Norway. I mean, there's a lot of things. Basically, I'd say it's a lot to do with the Murdoch press, unfortunately. The narrative, the storytelling that's been told. That any time, I mean, yesterday even the New South Wales government here implemented a climate change fund to help raise public awareness, to help biodiversity, save koalas. But the front pages of all the Murdoch press were like, green tax, they're going to rob our, prices of electricity are going to go up. Like, there's a story being told. And we learnt that in Queensland with the election as well. There was a failure of communicating these solutions in a way that says you can have jobs, we can strengthen your community. It was all about fear. And we know that when people get fearful, they double down. Sweden, for example, now, I mean, they're doing remarkable things, but they've even introduced this concept in their airports. I'm not sure if you've seen it, called a fly shame. So they've invented a word to try and shame people out of flying less. So they've put it all across their airports, just to sort of say, hey, have you thought about how much you're actually flying? So also their tax structures are very different to Australia. We've really followed a very sort of neoliberal agenda here, like America did, whereas a lot of those Northern European countries still tax quite heavily on corporations and wealthy, and then use that money to distribute it. So, yes.
I just wondered, do you have your top 3 actionable tips that everyone can do, like, from today?
Yeah. So I think the problem's been that we've been quite prescriptive with advice about what to do. I think quite often you hear eat less meat, ride your bike to work, but that doesn't really resonate with everyone in particular. So we have developed on our website. We've worked with about 50 different organisations to develop an action plan, a personalised action plan. So if you go to our website, whatsyour2040.com, there's a button that says activate your plan. And we ask you what type of person you are, what your interests are, how much time you have available. Then based on those preferences, we'll give you 6 or 7 things that you can do right now. Yeah, so I would encourage you to go and activate your plan. There's lots of things. Yes?
I was wondering who your creative and storytelling influences are.
Good question. Who my influences are? I don't know. I appreciate anyone that sort of tells a story a little differently and takes a risk and is willing to step outside of a conventional way of doing things. And there's not anyone in particular. It's just if I come across something, I'll if it resonates and I appreciate the bravery or the way of trying to express something differently, that's who I appreciate. Yeah. Yes, mate.
You talked before about how negative news sources are now.
Yes.
Are there any news sources that you listen to that are positive?
Yeah.
Like struggling with
Yeah, so the question's about there's just so much negativity. Where are the positive news stories? Yeah, that's what we're trying to create, is a bit of a platform for that, like an actual media entity that can actually just focus on the solutions without being sort of blindly optimistic and utopian, but actually favouring that solutions narrative. We worked a lot with an organisation out of America called Project Drawdown, and they've actually looked at the 100 most substantive solutions to reversing global warming and ranked them in order. And they have an incredible set of resources and materials, and they're often putting out stories and videos and whatnot. So there's great content there around environment stuff. But yeah, look, it's tricky, as you said, and sometimes there's a lot of sensationalism out there as well. It's like getting that right balance. So we're trying to sort of cultivate that ourselves at the moment. So I'd have a look at our channels as well. We've got lots more content on our website, but also on our social media channels. We're constantly putting out stories and things like that. Yep. Yes?
First of all, thanks for the film.
Mm.
If you haven't seen it, it is so about hope, and
Mm.
I think that's the narrative you really
Thanks.
like. Otherwise, there's no hope for anyone.
Yeah.
I've walked away from it. It's awesome. On that note, as a filmmaker myself, who was making something, when you've got so much stuff and it's probably like that process over 3 years, how do you decide we're going to showcase those
Yeah.
3 to 4 things? Because I imagine it was, and who are you working with to help you figure that out?
Yeah, well, the first cut of the film was about 3 hours and 35 minutes because there were so many things in it, which is a great thing. There were so many solutions out there that we had to leave out. But it ultimately came down to, again, I talked about this underlying metaphor around there are solutions out there that come from, I think, quite a reductionist mechanistic mindset, which is let's just build giant carbon-sucking machines on the edge of our cities and just like a Band-Aid solution, get rid of all the carbon. Or there's talk about reflecting the sun back into space, like huge geoengineering projects, which I think have the potential to be disastrous, the untold, unknown consequences. So we tried to find things that had really powerful cascading benefits that even if climate change wasn't an issue, we want to do them anyway. So the soil, for example, we need to do that to provide healthier food. Let's do that. But the bonus is it's pulling down carbon from the atmosphere, educating and empowering girls. Let's do that anyway. But then we get this wonderful side effect. So they had to be a sort of coming from a more holistic approach than just a really simple silver bullet type of solution. And again, the seaweed's probably the one that I'm the most excited about, just how remarkable that solution is in terms of not just pulling the carbon, but what it can do to the oceans, regenerate the oceans and have these giant forests out at sea for fish to thrive in, and to actually alkalise the water. Fantastic, So it was just about whittling down those as we went along. But yes, I had a lot of help. I had a research of the first 8 months, just her and I researching, and I spoke to probably 70 different academics and economists and researchers. And then I had a really wonderful editor through the process, and we just constantly pulled our hair out and sat around. But that's the best part, that's the magic part of putting a film together. Oh, I don't know how many hours. It would have, been. We went to 17 countries and it took a long time to put it all together, but there is, at the moment, talk about a series, doing a 6 to 8 part series, so a lot of that stuff we can use and keep getting it out there. Yeah. So what's next is we have been funded philanthropically to sort of keep this message going alive, so we've just been overwhelmed actually with the amount of sort of community screenings, schools, corporations, all the banks, sporting organisations, governments. We did a New South Wales government parliamentary screening last night. There's just so many things that are happening with the film that I think I'm sort of going to do that for a lot longer. And then we released the film overseas in October through Europe, and then in America early next year. The UN just told us on Friday they're going to show 3 minutes of the film to every world leader at the General Assembly in September to open it. I know, it's great. So I think it's, I don't feel like there is a more important topic than this. So unless we get this right, nothing else is going to matter for a while. So I think whatever I do moving forward will be under this umbrella. But I think probably a fleshed out series will be next. And a lot of the things I had to leave out of the film. Yeah. Yeah, so the question's about how do we talk about this topic without sort of putting people offside, I guess. I think the key is to meet people where they're at. I think what we're learning, and especially from the election, is that any sort of militancy or fanaticism just isn't. I mean, there's enough of that in the world as it is, you know, and people just shut down. And in fact, the studies show they'll double down even more on what their belief is if you come at them with an attacking energy, or that you need to do this, or anything that's righteous. So I think it's about meeting them where we're at, but also talking at the values that we all can connect with. Whether you're extreme left or extreme right, we all value kids, clean water, clean air, and community. So it's actually talking at a human level, which I think we've forgotten to do. And also I think through no fault of our own that we've often communicated this purely through a scientific lens. And as I said before, it's very hard for people to connect with what does 2 degrees warming mean? What does anthropogenic mean? They're not terms that stir the soul or really deep down connect with us. So I think that's the way to meet people. Talk as a human being and the things we value in the future for our kids we want to create. Yeah.
So was there a lot of behavioural and psych research you did?
Yeah, so the question is, was there a lot of behaviour and psych research? There was, and in particular, Renee Lertzman, who's the environmental psychologist, I spoke to her quite a lot, and she was really great around also letting ourselves feel the depth of what is going on, especially our children are feeling it right now. There's a lot of get phone calls quite often from friends with their 10 or 11-year-old who's in tears at the kitchen table because they've just read a new UN report. And she talks about needing to acknowledge that, and that it would be great if more of our leaders did that, because when you do acknowledge that, it frees up the space to then start having a discussion about solutions. But so many of us are repressing that. We're just putting it away, we're picking up our phones, whatever, because we don't want to actually deal with the enormity of what it means. But the more we can step into that and go, yep, shit, things are pretty bad right now, then we have space to actually solve the problem. Yeah. Yeah.
What was your design process behind curating the view of 2040? So I'm kind of curious, you didn't speak to how you did research for
Yep.
templates, but I'm curious to kind of see what design was
Design.
like everyday life.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's about how do we design all the images of 2040 and whatnot. That was by far the best fun of the whole experience. And I had one particular designer, Luke Bubb, him and I worked together a lot, and he actually did a lot of design in like a virtual reality space. So we would build driverless cars in that space and then be able to walk around and look at them and how they interact with the city. Where would the door be? Which side of the road is it going to pull over on? And then the special effects guys was a group called Cumulus, and they have 20 staff, and they were all under 25. And just to see them come alive at designing their future. You know, they weren't doing Coke commercials or horror films. They were starting to think about, what does a rooftop garden look like? What type of trees would they be? What would a Hyperloop station look like going through here in Melbourne and stuff? It was magic, you know. And again, it was getting back to the collective dreaming and the imagination that is in all of us, and we see it in our kids, but we're not accessing it enough. And I think the film gave them permission to do that and really dream and then manifest it and see it come to life. And now, you know, when I told them that the UN are going to show that, that's their dreaming. Their vision is now going to be planted as a seed in front of every world leader. It's an extraordinary thing for them to do. Yeah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, so the questions around wealthier nations versus poorer nations and the role here and what impact is Australia having. And the reality is that about 60% of global emissions come from the wealthiest 7% of people. So it's our excess that is causing the problems. And that's the toughest part, is the countries like Bangladesh, Tanzania, Ethiopia, they're all responding much faster because they're feeling the impacts of our indulgence. And I'm not sure if you saw last week, but the people of Ethiopia in one day planted 350 million trees. Like an extraordinary achievement of human ingenuity. And this is what we're capable of. This is why I have hope that we're going to get through it, because look what they're doing. But they're doing it because they're feeling the brunt. We're sort of protected by it at the moment because of the resources that we have. So I just think it's such an immature cop-out to say that, oh, we're only a small country. Because also, if you factor in the coal we're exporting to other countries, suddenly our emissions are about 5%, which makes us one of the most polluting countries in the world. But that was conveniently left out. So we do have a responsibility. You know, we're very lucky here, and I think our actions are impacting the rest of the world, so we need to take responsibility. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, great question about how do we actually find our agency and step up beyond the individual actions. And those individual actions do matter, and not so much of what they do collectively, but I think the cultural norms that we start sending each other about what's acceptable. And we're starting to see that with keep cups and whatnot, but even the research says that if you put solar on your roof, the odds of your neighbour putting solar on their roof goes up exponentially, because we're starting to send each other social cues about what's acceptable in the current state. I think there is a role where we actually need to go beyond just the individual action and approach our councils, demand they declare a climate emergency, pester them, like find that sort of part of you that's really ready to go up and actually become that inner activist. The climate strike's a great one. September 20th is the next big global climate strike, and all the kids are asking all of us to join them. And that's working. I think we've got to know that that is working. The UK declared a climate emergency based on the climate strike. They attested it to the climate strike kids. We've got 32 councils in Australia that have now declared a climate emergency, and there's 1 or 2 happening every week. So there is this groundswell of momentum that's happening. And historically, this is how change has happened. It hasn't happened from the top down. It is local councils, organisations, and slowly they build and build and build until they reach a tipping point, and then it becomes a national issue. We saw that with interracial marriage in America, the suffragettes, women being told to get off the streets because men make the important decisions. They kept going. Abolitionists, everyone told them that slavery would never end, that it was utopian to think that the economy could run without slaves, and they kept at it. And they kept marching, and they kept joining in the streets and building momentum. And I think that's happening right now. It'd be very hard to deny that there is some kind of groundswell happening around the world right now. And in fact, Colombia just did a really interesting study that looked at any time a government was overthrown or any type of territory was liberated, it took 3.5% of a population to be actively involved for that tipping point to happen. So I reckon we're not far away from that globally right now, and certainly what I've seen, there's magic happening everywhere and huge change. So it's about not losing hope and actually keeping going. Yeah. Oh yes, we've got to end it there. Thank you everyone for listening.
Do you have anything else you want to say? Or? No. Thank you so much.